I think you've given me a very tall order. There's no way I can cover all the things that you're talking about today. It's even difficult to know where to start in this whole thing. But I think that one of the things that all of us are engaged in when we do historical studies as scholarship is that we are engaged in trying to understand events, trying to understand what happened, and trying to understand what happened. It is not an accident that the field of scholarship starts with philosophy, because that's they call us doctors of philosophy, you know, PhDs. This is because you begin to think about what it is that you're looking at and what it is, what makes it what it is. What are we trying to understand when we say we want to understand what has happened? What are we trying to understand in an event? I think we could start from that very simple thing. What is an event? You drop a pencil on the floor, that is an event. You can dispute how it fell, you can go around and around about it, but it's a rather simple event. But the problems that we face as historians are more than just simple events. We deal with events of various magnitude and complexity and compound complexity. We could also say, for example, the Second World War was an event of colossal magnitude with millions of parts and events and circumstances and contingencies and so forth. And there have been works on this that have come out just recently. For example, a major work came out on the Second World Wars by a noted scholar out on the West Coast in this country. He shows it in all of its various complexity, but he is also analyzing those events. And in order to analyze and understand events, we use language and we use concepts. And I think that we need to understand what it is when what we're talking about when we talk about a concept. There are different kinds of concepts. Do we understand the categories, different kinds of concepts? There are concepts of entity, there are concepts of institution, there are concepts of process, there are concepts with regard to systems, there are concepts which we call ideologies. Some of these are characterized in the English language with suffixes such as ISM, modernism, communism. These are systems, but they are also names for ideologies. But we also use a suffix for process. Things that are happening and things that are coming into being, we use the term characterization, westernization, civilization, and so forth. These are processes of things which have taken time to formulate and to come into being. I think one of the things that one can do as a young scholar is to contemplate and meditate on the nature of what it is one's looking at. Now, on the opposite end of it, of course, we look at, as young scholars, we look at data, we look at evidence, we work with other scholars who teach us and instruct us in how we should go, and we begin to formulate ideas with regard to our understandings of these. And it can be quite overwhelming for a young scholar. Oftentimes a mentor can help him to go a little bit further along. But I start with this very simple language with regard to need to understand categories of concepts, categories of institutions. we organize these things into various, put them into various packages, and these too can be contested in various ways. Thus, for example, we get to a concept which has been, several concepts which have been disputed with respect to India over the last 40 or 50 years. Some of these, incidentally, I have described in my book on historical understanding, which you've alluded to here. Amongst these concepts, you get the concept of India. We take it for granted, many people take it for granted that there's always been an India. But has there been a consciousness of an India as a people, as a single people, or was it a geographical concept? Was it a cultural concept? What kind of a concept was it? Who were the first people to use the term? How did it come into being? Well, we know from the records that it was the Persians who used the word with regard to a satrapy of the Persian Empire that was on the Indus River. And they called the people beyond the Indus Sindhu people. Along came the Greeks, and the Greeks coined the term Indica. And that term was used by Megasthenes and by other writers. And for centuries, the term was applied to the people who lived to everything that happened, everything that occurred, all the phenomena, trade, culture, people, anything that fitted into the geographical receptacle of what lay beyond the Indus River. At a later time, we find that when the Muslims come into India, they carry the same language with them, and they begin to apply to the Turks when they come into North India. They rule over a part of North India, and they call it Hindustan. But was the word India as we now know it in existence at that time? Was there a consciousness of India? And what do we mean when we say India today? This is where some of your contests take place, because some historians who say there was a nation of India. There's a single nation of India, and so forth. Now there has also been a similar kind of contestation over the term Hindu and the rise of the modern concept of Hinduism as applying not just to a people, but to a particular system of religion and culture. Now, I'm tracing the development of modern India and modern Hinduism. I discovered that the term Hindu and India used in the modern sense are kind of twins that developed as part of the vocabulary of those who worked for the East India Company, and particularly of the first Governor General, Warren Hasting, who decided on a huge venture to discover what was in the subcontinent, what cultures lay here, what the geography was, what the coins were. He launched a series of parallel ventures, all of them in the 1780s. One of them, for example, was the All-India Geographical Survey and the building of the maps of India, starting with a colonel by the name of Colin McKenzie. Another great project that he launched upon an enormous project, was to uncover and get copies of or collections of manuscripts giving the ancient lore of India. And he coined the term India for the purpose of collecting all of these various things. And so there was an all-India survey of manuscripts in which hosts of Brahmin and Kayastha and other servants of the East India Company fanned out into the villages, collected materials, and where somebody wouldn't give them a copy of a manuscript, they would have it copied. They would buy whatever they could buy, they would copy whatever they could copy, and eventually this enormous project which he put together, by the time he died, and I think it was about 1821 or something like that, he was a bachelor. He had spent his entire private fortune, Colin McKenzie, on collecting materials that he himself felt were very important, and he bequeathed these to the East India Company, and the East India Company found that 5 loaded, what would have been super carriers of that time, East Indiamen, were used to take these manuscripts all to London. Well, you can imagine what the directors of the company thought when all of these materials were suddenly dumped on the shore there. Well, they didn't have any room for it. They turned around and they said, we'll keep the stuff which has been translated into English, but we'll send it all back to India. Where is that material? It lies in the Oriental Manuscripts Library of the university, next to the University of Madras. This is an enormous amount of material that still has yet to be plumbed by many scholars. And it contains Sanskrit material, Pali material, material in every language that you can imagine. When I was doing my own research on Guntur, I got into what was called the Eliot collection. The Eliot collection was a takeoff on the manuscripts of Colin McKenzie's collection. Now, who did the manuscript collecting? Was it Colin McKenzie? No. He had 20 to 25 people who were employed day after day, month after month, in village after village to collect all of this material. Raw material for historical scholarship. You can compare this venture with in American history with the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was an expedition of exploration in which the lore of this country, of India, was brought up and saved and preserved for posterity. A similar thing was done with coins. There was a numismatic collection for all of India. And I could go on and on. There was an All-India Archaeological Survey. Now, I bring this up because the very concepts of India came out of the development of these projects at that particular time. But one of the things which brought the concept into being also, because Europeans had just used the word up until then, East Indies. What did they mean by East Indies? Well, and even earlier, the Muslims had used a different term. They had called Hindavi or Hindustan, but there was also a sense of a Persianate world that stretched beyond and beyond and beyond. For them, East Indies stretched all the way over to Indonesia and included all of Southeast Asia as we know it today. So at a particular time, a focus was put upon specifically on the subcontinent of India alone. Another set of developments, which I think historians have plumbed, is what I would call the constitutional history of India. From whence came the Constitution of India that was established in 1950? Well, it is really a combination of many little elements that were put together. Charters, grants, agreements, treaties. There's a whole set of volumes called the Synods and Treaties of India. At the same time, there were the East India Company charters, which granted rights to and authority to the particular government. And then there were treaties between the company and various princes of India, who also established the relationships with what was then growing up as called the Government of India. The Government of India came into being in 1772. So if you examine the development of these things, you can begin to see where the roots of some of the modern concepts have come. I'll stop here for a minute to see if you have any questions at this point, because I may want to depart in a different direction. Any questions?
No, this is very
said
interesting.
that the government, or was it something of India, was formed in 1772? The government of India?
The All-India Government of India was formed in 1772.
By who?
It was established by the East India Company.
Okay.
And this was a combination of treaties and synods. And there is a series of volumes by Atchison, which puts all these treaties and synods, and that included not just the charters of the company, but also the treaties with various princes, because there were over 600 princely states with which the company was in a relationship. So there were two parts to India. There was princely India, and there were the presidencies, Bombay, Madras, Bengal, Bombay, Madras, and so on. Bengal eventually grew all the way up the Hindustan plain up into the northwest provinces and up to Punjab, so that later on the term was used British India as distinct from princely India. And those concepts were there, and built into those provisions were various kinds of rights and responsibilities and due process of law, systems of courts. There was an all-India survey of all the laws of Manu, the laws of India, which were codified in the Hindu code. This was also established and started by Warren Hastings. And later on, a school of historians came along, which you know about, which debunked all this and called this Orientalism. You know the word?
Yes.
Orientalism. Now, Edward Zide, I should remind you, was not a historian per se. He was a literature person, a literary critic. He was from Lebanon, and he was speaking in terms of the Middle East, but he applied this to India, and one of his students, Gayatri, I'm trying to think of her name just now. Sorry, I'm having a senior moment.
Gauri
Vishwanathan.
Vishwanathan.
Gayatri Spivak, Professor.
Yeah.
No.
Well,
no.
that's a different
Post-colonial scholar.
Vishwanathan did this work and so forth. Now, the interesting thing about this, that they attributed to the Europeans this Orientalism. But as a matter of fact, for every European who was engaged became very Indianized themselves, there were 20 to 25 Indian scholars who were engaged in this work, in the collecting of this material, so that the real Orientalists here were not Europeans at all, most of them. They were Indians themselves. So the term has become contested. And in fact, the two of the main contestants of this have been a person by the name of Robert Irwin, and another person by the name of an Egyptian by the name of Warwick. Ibn Warwick they have written books on Edward Zide saying a lot of what he wrote was nonsense. And of course, if you understand where he's coming from, he was a Marxist. And he was just one of a series of different Marxist schools who've had an influence on various currents of fashion in the developing of the interpretation of Indian history. I could name several of these. I suppose the oldest of these is called postmodernism or post-structuralism, which really begins again with literary criticism. It didn't come out of history, it came out of literary criticism. And there it started with the work of a man by the name of Saussure, a Frenchman, who said, you've got to understand symbols, and for every symbol, there's a counter symbol. He was using a Hegelian model, and of course, he was followed by other scholars. I could name all of them, but I don't want to spend all the time on this, except to say that the Foucault and the postmodernists that came along thereafter were in the process of trying to deconstruct the history of every country that they came across. And in the process of doing so, a school of deconstructionists came to India, and that process began. And I would say its greatest fashionable followers were in Bengal. The next school that came along were called the subalternists. You know the term?
Yes.
Okay. Who started the subaltern school? He was a colleague of that I had that knew him at Chicago. He was a Bengali by the name of Ranajit Guha.
Yes, exactly.
And they developed, in fact, you have taken the word collective from them. They developed a series of people, and he was followed by another person by the name of Gayatri Spivak.
Yes.
And Chakravarti Spivak. Now, if you've read some of their work, any of you read their work, Subaltern School?
Yes. Yes,
well,
we have.
I found this after a while that they used, this was true of the postmodernists, this was true of the subalternists, it was true of the post-Orientalists, that they engaged, and in fact, they employed not only language of literary criticism, but they employed the language of cultural anthropology and the concepts of cultural anthropology. And many of the concepts that they developed were never defined, and they developed so much of a vocabulary that you could almost say that they developed a kind of special insider language of a kind of a priesthood, that unless you learned their language and spoke in their language and genuflected before the deities that they put in front of you, you would never be able to understand what they were talking about.
Exactly.
I don't know what John Webster thinks of that idea. What do
Exactly.
you think, John?
I agree with you.
I certainly agree with your views about special language. I had a colleague who, when he got to writing, was in a world of his own almost. And I used to tease him about it. His more recent what I found so objectionable, particularly I find the subaltern school on the whole rather useless in studying Christianity because in India, because it covers over some of the more important divisions that are present within Christianity and between Christians and other Indians. You have to get into volume 6 before they begin to notice caste and untouchability as somehow relevant.
Yeah.
People are simply put into class categories, and this whole aspect of Indian life gets lost. The other thing is that when you get into tribals, I've spent some time in Mizoram, and to think of the Mizos as subalterns may work in Bangalore, but it sure doesn't work in Mizoram. I think you spend a half an hour in Mizoram, and they're not subalterns up there at all. It has the second highest literacy rate in India. Some of these things just don't work very well in my field of study, and so I think it's a good idea to get below the elite level, which is what they succeeded in doing, and to give it an autonomy vis-a-vis the elites, which I think was a good notion and a necessary one. But after that, some of the analysis I found to be not very helpful at all.
Well, let's take the point subaltern and define it temporarily. What did they meant or underneath the elite? Well, who were the first elites? Well, they meant those people who were not British. When the independent government came, then they meant those people who were not of the ruling class. But who are the people who are writing subaltern history? Most of them that started in Bengal, they're Bengalis, and they're part of a particular group of Bengalis who call themselves the Bhadralok. Do you know the word?
Sure do.
You know what it means? They're the gentry of Bengal. They're all of them Brahmins. They're all of them with a tremendous amount of English knowledge. They've gone to the finest universities in the country. Ranajit Guha himself was, I think, half Czech or something like this and half Bengali. And many of my closest colleagues and friends over the years came out of an extremely privileged background. So were they the subalterns? No. Well, who are the people? Well, if you want to look at it, my own work established that the Indian Empire that we know was really on the work of lots of Indians. Yes, they were subalterns. They worked for the Indian Empire to begin with, and now they work for the Indian nation. And many of them are literate. They acquire literacy, but they're the upward mobile people who are just below and who serve to make the system go. Well, in India, there were somewhat like 300,000 civil servants who were Indians at different ranks. Some of them could be considered elite. By the 1890s, the chief justices, the chief judges on the Sudra Dalit, the Supreme Court of South India, were a very, very elite group of Brahmins. They weren't Europeans. Underneath them were others. Are they the subalterns? So you can keep going down to a next level, to the next level, to the next level, and so on. But I felt all along the important thing is to have Indians explain the history of India, and this was what my own work was really about, subalterns, but you didn't use the word subaltern in those days. I didn't think it was necessary. It was Ranajit Guha who developed this term, and I think it came out of a Marxist ideology that he had developed from Antonio Gramsci and people like that, you see. So that fashion has come and gone now. And you will find more fashions that'll come along after that. The current fashion, of course, you know what it is. The current fashion, as I understand it in India, and the, what is it, the Council of Indian Research are pushing the historiography of Hindutva. Is this not right?
Yes, that's true.
From where are they getting their sources?
Yes, Professor, if I may just come in, this is Ashish here.
Yeah.
Now, we left off at subaltern. So this concern with the weak, with the vulnerable, with the downtrodden is what, some of these historians, they claim that they are doing. But what this whole idea of victimhood has become very interesting, because the Hindutva rewriting of history is basically taking recourse to this victimhood. They're saying that we Hindus have been the victim of colonial aggression, Islamic aggression, and then Christian aggression. Now, this is where the revisionary history is going. And your whole idea, which I like, was that history has become a rhetoric. And if you can spend some time, maybe another 15 minutes, on history as rhetoric and how it has been appropriated by the revisionary history of Hindutva. If you can speak on that for about 15 minutes.
I would like to, Ashish, approach this. You know, yes, they talk. This is victimhood. This is the story. Subalterns were the oppressed, but they really weren't the most oppressed. They were the level right below the oppressed. In the military, the subaltern is the person who's a sergeant and so forth in the military. But I would like to approach this a little bit differently and introduce to you some cultural histories that have been written, that are being written now, or written from a cultural perspective. How many of you are familiar with the work of Richard Eaton? Any of you know the work of Richard Eaton? Richard Eaton has come out with a major book this last year on India in the Persian Age. Now, what he is arguing and what he has produced and developed is a sense that from around the year 1000 or thereabout, when Mahmud of Ghazni came into India, but thereafter, when the Turks came into India, they came not just as Muslims, but they came speaking the Persian language. And when they came and when they ruled in North India, they spread a Persianate culture, which was very inclusive, in which it included a host, in fact, a majority of the people who were involved in the Persianate culture were in fact non-Muslims and people who were indigenous to all of the various communities of India itself that was ruled in the Persianate age. So he develops this quite fully, and I think you'd find this a very challenging book. You could say that there was an overlay, that the earlier culture, that in all India like this, you could see India in the age, in which a Brahminic influence has spread over large numbers of people, but in fact had not penetrated very deeply, because the Brahmins were made 5% of the population, a very small elite group at the top, but nevertheless have had, and to this day continue to have, an enormous influence on the language and on the cultures of India. Eaton's argument is that Persian has had a similar kind of influence, and that for a long period of time, even the Marathas and the Maratha Empire kept their records in Persian and used Persian vocabulary for their empire. so that you had the emulation of the Persian age going on right into the 19th century. And you had even the Maharaja of Travancore emulating the Mughals in the Persian style of the culture that he was of his kingdom. Now, if you take that and move to the more modern period, you could say that there has been, India now lives in a period which I don't have the right word for it, but I could say an Indo-English or English age, in which there's nothing so pervasive in all of India, which is the glue that holds India together, and which all of you are speaking to me with me right now, and that is the influence of English in India and English of Indians outside of India, and India and this and how this is penetrating in every area, even down to the rickshaw wallahs in some places. In other words, it's startling to realize that in the English-speaking world of our day, Indian English is a separate language, a separate culture, which embodies and encloses within it a huge number of Sanskrit words, an enormous number of Persian words, all kinds of indigenous Indian words, has its own particular syntaxes and styles and so forth. And in fact, I'm tempted to call this language Indish and this culture Indish rather than English per se. But you know, in the English-speaking world, wherever you go, you are going to be understood. And many a person in Hyderabad is speaking with a computer person who's having trouble in Madison, Wisconsin right now. They call up on the phone, who are they talking to? But some computer person in Hyderabad or Bangalore or Delhi or so forth. And that person may be speaking in a slightly Indian accent, but nevertheless, they are using a common vocabulary. So that the English language and culture today, India is the second largest English-speaking culture in the world. I don't know if you know that. There are more people speaking English in India than in Britain. There are more people speaking and reading in English in India. Not only that, but the English in India has a sort of class system almost. There's very high English and there's middle levels of English, and there are various kinds of local kinds of rogue Englishes and so forth. But some of the patrician language of people who teach at JNU and come out of the very elite schools of Delhi and Dehradun and other places like this are as polished a language as you can find at Oxford or Cambridge or anywhere else. Anuradha Roy is a polished speaker of English who writes in English and makes an enormous influence. People who have gotten the great prizes in English literature today are in English. Who in the United States wins all the spelling bees and the contests that occur here in this country? There are first prizes to an Indian, the second prize is to an Indian, the third prize is to an Indian. And this goes on every year. How do you explain this? Well, there's a certain characteristic of Indian culture that you may not be fully conscious of. And that is that within the oral traditions of India and in Sanskrit particularly, mnemonic devices were developed so that Indians have a genius for memorization. And that genius enabled them to win spelling bees and do all kinds of things in mathematics that people elsewhere can't do. These are peculiar to a particular culture. And I'd say, as a historian looking at all of India today and looking at what are the things that make India tick and what is it that characterizes Indian history and how can you explain this? One of the concepts which I'm developing and thinking about is this enormous influence that this particular thing. Is it European? No, it's Indian. It's distinctly Indian. It has been adopted in India. In other words, you can call this, if you want to use it, the English used in India is a Prakrit of English. It's a separate language derived from, but it is without this particular bond of language and without the system of laws and courts and so forth, Hindutva would not be able to do what it is doing today in India. If you were to remove, if they were to be serious about the things talk about, couldn't rule India using Sanskrit. Have I departed very far, Ashish, from what you wanted me to talk about? Yes.
You take us wherever you want. We are happy journeying with you. Yes.
Yeah. So I think this is a very challenging idea. And I have been working with this idea for some time. And I challenge you to go into the sources, go down into the records, go down to find out what you can find out from them, and come to the Madras Manuscripts Library and look for yourself and see what's there. I think that it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I think the opportunities for historical research have never been so great as they are right now in India. But unfortunately, if they're going to be subsidized by a government which only supports Hindutva historiography, we have problems.
This whole field of history writing it's very interesting. Dr. Webster was speaking to us last month, and he said that he is somebody who has done the donkey's work, because page after page he looks for ideas or facts. And when I read your work, I see that you are fascinated with facts, and that's the kind of history you are doing. But and you mentioned in your chapter about, you appreciate somebody like Nicholas Dirks, who does some fantastic, he reaches out to the sources, and he does that old school kind of history. But then he also slips into this rhetoric. What do you think, what explains this kind of seduction of rhetoric in history that we see now? Why do we have more histories of that nature? And this seduction into rhetoric actually is then abused by the revisionist historians. So that's something that, if you can comment, and Dr. Webster is here, that why do our historians keep falling into this trap of rhetoric, of theory? Why do they genuflect to theory so much now?
Well, the interesting thing is that oftentimes the term theory is used as a cover word. My mind is made up. They have their conclusions are already made. Nicholas Dirks comes with some preconceptions. He doesn't come. I would say that the true historian tries to tease out some ideas from the data that he has, rather than coming full blown at it with a theory that is really perhaps even an ideology in disguise, and saying that this, then he tries to fit the data to fit what his preconceptions are. I've taken issue with Nick Dirks on some of the things that he has done, but he's done some very good work on Pudukkottai, and I appreciate his research, but he's an anthropologist by training originally. And this is the Chicago school. These are people who were the students of Bernard Cohen, many of them. And a lot of people came out of Chicago with that particular approach, as distinct from the Cambridge people or the Oxford people and others. But some of the very finest historians in India were themselves Marxist, and then they also bent before the facts. I mean, amongst them are Tapan Rai Chowdhury, a number of people like this that I could name, and his students, and so forth. they themselves were producing extremely good history for a long time, and I think we can learn a great deal from these people.
Right. Uh, Maybe we should just take some questions from our friends who are here. Dr. Webster is here. If you would like to say something before we start taking some questions from our participants.
John, you have some comments?
I don't want to pull you into any controversy, Dr. Webster. You need to unmute. But
Yes.
yes.
Yeah, I just find, that what is fashionable, what earns you a promotion in your department, and these kinds of things vary over time. These different schools become fashionable, or approaches become fashionable for a time. I agree with Bob. I think Marxist history really was a great blessing in the sense that it explored the inner dynamics of Indian society in an age when everything was Indians versus the British. And there came a time after independence when it was necessary to think, okay, the British are gone, what's it about our own society that makes us tick? And the Marxists had some answers, and they wrote their history accordingly. And then other people came along and said, well, that's not exactly right. They looked at things through, or either looked at things through a different lens, or on the basis of their research came to different conclusions that challenged those. And so the discipline evolves.
Exactly. And it continues to do so today. But now challenge is coming from the Hindutva people.
Right.
But the unfortunate thing is that if you go into classical Indian history, and here I sat at the feet of A.L. Basham when I was a graduate student at London. He's the one who first invited me to come there, and then later on shared a seminar with Romila Thapar, and have read her books and those who followed her, and so forth. Within coming out of classical lore in Indian language, the terms for history, perhaps the most down-to-earth word used, the Sanskrit word is itihasa, though there's a more current word, charitra. You may be familiar with the word charitra.
Right.
And then itihasa. But behind that are the great sort of semi-mythic things called Puranas. This Purana, there would be what were called, in South India, we have the things called the Sthala Puranas. In other words, the story of this place, the story of this temple, the story of this village, and so forth, the Sthala Puranas. And then behind that, you had these great mythic things, which were called kathas. They're great. And then you have the great epic myths that you have running on Indian television and films and so on, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and so forth and so on. And these things are seen by the Hindutva people as not merely great mythic epics, but as history. And they bring them to the Puranas and so forth, and then they bring them down to another level and so forth. And they say they are itihasa or they're charitra. Well, good historical research will contest that, because you want to find out. None of us are free from, or exempt from an understanding of events outside of our Christian theology. Our Christian theology informs how we look at events as being events that need to be examined carefully. And anyone who looks at the Hebrew history, the history of the Old Testament, recognizes that not only it's not just that you had Herodotus and Thucydides who developed two kinds of history out of the Greeks, but perhaps some of the best, earliest histories in the world were written by the Hebrews themselves. And what do these histories tell us? These histories tell us of things that other histories don't often emphasize. Failings, human failings. In relationships to God, man has failed and failed and failed over and over again in his relationships, not just with God, but with each other. And this has been the way with nations and with kingdoms that have risen and fallen. And therefore, the Hebrew writers wrote and they told about the misdeeds of David, the misdeeds of this king, the misdeeds of that king, the way in which society was corrupting itself, and so forth,
Yes,
chasing after other gods.
That's a fascinating introduction of a new topic, that Bible as history, Bible as why Bible-believing cultures have taken history so seriously. I would go to one question.
What I'm saying here, Ashish, though, is that silently underneath it all, we cannot escape as historians understanding that we ourselves implicitly have a theology which informs our willingness to look at human failure as well as human success. And that theology informs us. It's not just that there's systemic racism as a term they talk in this country. I would say that biblical theological approach says there's a systemic sin, systemic human failure. How do you deal with human failure? That's a very theological thing, and that informs, and therefore we don't pull our punches. We call a spade a spade. We say that this was an evil deed. We actually discuss evil deeds, which some kinds of history will gloss over. See, so this is a implicit theological foundation to historical understanding that we cannot escape, or nor can we deny, nor should we deny that. Pardon my interruption, Ashish.
Yeah, I know, no problem. Pardon my interruption.
Yeah.
But could we take some questions? And well, one question that has come from Dr. Finney Phillip is, he says, on the semantic line of the question, Esther 1:1 uses Hodu for India. Any thoughts on the background of this?
I didn't quite catch you, Ashish.
It says in Esther, in the book of Esther in the Old Testament, you do have a mention of India, Hodu, the word Hodu for India. Any thoughts on the background of this? Is India mentioned? Okay.
Not really.
No.
I know that there are also mentions of peacocks and other things that give reference to that, but not really. No.
The other, I mean, people have a few more questions if I can read out. Somebody wants your opinion on the Criminal Tribes Act. Have you had a chance to deal with that question, the Criminal Tribes Act? Some of the tribes were designated as criminal tribes by the British.
The notified tribes, right?
Yeah,
There were in fact particularly groups. If you look at the grassroots study of the records, the local records of South India, you will find that there were castes among the Adivasis. They were called Adivasis, You know, that's the Sanskrit word for aboriginal. These Adivasis were in fact trained to commit robbery. Hereditary castes who trained to commit robbery or theft. Great skills in just developing how to steal. And incidentally, that's a whole category of historical understandings that that have come out of India that we as Christian historians need to appreciate. And that is the whole business of family histories and local histories as coming out of what are called lineages, vamshavalis. The family history. Now, there were hereditary groups, father to son, who trained in, you know, that in many castes, skills were passed on from father to son in many crafts, whether in goldsmiths or people who were in Kerala who learned to become fencing masters. I'm having a memory just now as to the name for their fencing school and the art of swordsmanship in Kerala became a craft of such great skill that in fact, yeah, Kalari Pait. But I'm trying to remember the name of of what they were called. It's even become a family name. But here we had people of extraordinary skills who learned from childhood how to fight. And the Dutch were absolutely blown away by this. And there are Dutch works on this subject. And you could go on in many other subjects. Those of you who may have fine gold work done, take your work to a goldsmith. You'll find that some goldsmiths' families go back hundreds of years, and they have trained in this whole business. Now, I think what you're referring to, Ashish, is that the records showed that certain groups, like the Yarakalas and others, were actually in the business of becoming, of being hereditary thieves, and were very skilled at this. And in fact, one of those groups were so good at the kind they did that when villages wanted watchmen in them, they would hire people from those villages to come and work for them, and so forth. And it is not an accident, you know, you have Gurkhas who come and get bank guards in India and so forth. So this kind of specialization as a hereditary skill. Now, when the records say criminal tribes and castes and tribes, what they're really referring to is a particular series of these kinds of particular groups that were identified, and they were not considered guilty. They were considered as people skilled in crafts.
Right. If I can take next question, it says, thank you, Professor Frykenberg, for the lecture. You spoke about the program of revisionist history has moved from postmodernism to subalternism to historiography of Hindutva. Meera Nanda says that there is a direct connection between these steps, or rather a progression. Are there three different steps, or is there necessary and inevitable progression there?
You know, maybe I'm becoming hard of hearing, Ashish, but I don't hear you very well.
Okay, maybe Charles, if you can directly ask. Maybe my voice is not going.
Yeah, sure. So my question was that you spoke about three different stages, how revisionist history program has developed in past few years, from postmodernism to subalternism, and then first step of historiography of Hindutva. And this is what Meera Nanda says in her book, is there a necessary progression from modernism, subcontinism to historiography of Hindutva? Would it, or are there three different stages, and in some places there is one stage which is prominent, in another place that's another stage?
I do not give credit to progression here at all. I think these are simply accidental. I think that these are simply accidental schools that came on one following the other. I would say the word I would use is fashion. I would say they were different fashions of history, which grabbed people's attention because of their persuasive power of those who were the leaders amongst them, who were very persuasive and so forth, and or who developed a kind of a circle of followers. You have a guru and he has a bunch of followers who follow him, and that becomes the fashion of the day. Thus, Edward Zyde, with his anti-Orientalism thing, totally failed to understand the real nature of Indology, and I think his student Gauri Vishwanathan likewise misunderstands. But she's a literary critic. He was a literary critic. I do not think that they were Pakka historians at all, in that sense. And thank goodness that fashion has long since gone. But I mean, all you have to do is realize the fact that the work that was being done by Indians for good, and it was not being done by Europeans at all. So how can you call this, but it was in France, it became a fashion after the Napoleonic War, and Zyde was working on that, you see, because the French conquerors of Egypt, of Napoleon, took the artifacts and the of Egypt and took them to Paris, and the study of these materials became a French fashion at that particular time, and it became a very fashionable thing to do Orientalism. And well, Edward Zyde development, not and he applies it to everybody else, you see, and I don't think that that's quite that's good history at all.
I would add to that I think one of the things that postmodernism did was to open the door wide to a total relativism, that all histories are constructions of the past, that the old standards don't necessarily apply. They are products of a certain time and mentality. I think what has happened as a result of this is that things that were considered to be legend and hagiography and so on now have a certain status or that they didn't have before. And this opens up the door to give a certain legitimacy to the kind of Hindutva history, Bob, that you were talking about.
Exactly. Exactly.
But what I find interesting in my latest visits to India, which shaped my little book on studying history, which is a how to do it book, I found that the postmodern thing really didn't take hold in India, in Indian academia, to the extent that it has here in the West. And what I've described as a more chastened modern approach, which I think has enough safeguards built into it to raise serious questions about Hindutva approaches to the past, that they still won't stand up quite as well. In other words, yes, relativism is there to be sure, but there are certain things that are against the rules, shall we say, of the profession.
Yeah.
And those safeguards against they don't establish what is true, but they also do a much better job on what cannot be trusted.
I think this is you've touched on something here. The West has drunk at the well of relativism, and parts of the historical profession have been infected by this. but there are lots of people within the historical profession who are not infected by this. The attempt to destroy historical knowledge is an ongoing industry in this country right now, with a new thing called the 1619 Project in this country, which is
Oh, I thought you were going to refer to presidential press conferences.
well, that's something else again. But I mean, the fact is that there are schools like this who are saying history is not valid. Nobody has a history that's valid. It's all relative. It's your choice or mine. In which case, it's all rhetoric. But it's not just rhetoric, but it could be empty rhetoric, and that is something we as historians would dispute. It's not empty rhetoric. But I would make this cautionary tale thing, and that is that even when we come to historical conclusions and you feel that you have a historical understanding about some events, we always need to step back and say that that is what we know so far. In other words, our understandings are contingent. Some new facts might come to light, some new understandings. Now, where these schools came in is that they didn't bring in new facts, they just brought in new theories sometimes. Sometimes what they did do is spur us to look at new facts, and that was useful. But when they didn't do that, they were not so useful. And I would say that the main historian in the West, the best ones, are still hewing to the discipline and have not been infected by relativism, but that relativism has made deep inroads, and it has come in from the sides, mainly from the social sciences and from literature.
If I may,
We have, yeah. Who's that? Okay.
if I may
Brother,
ask Dr. Tiwari, who is a professor of religion and an authority on Hinduism, if he can also shed some light on this whole understanding of history in the Indian context, that would be good. Dr. Tiwari, by the way, let me say a few words. Dr. Tiwari is a professor of religion and the former registrar of the Senate of Serampur, and we are very happy to have you, sir.
Good to meet you, Ravi. Good to meet you.
Yeah, thank you. My interest was to understand the historians and historiography, as you see, and you have written, so you have looked at it. So for my own beneficial, but I think you have added a few things which touches religion and the aspect of religion and its impact or its input into religion. I was also thinking that the Christian history has taken it through the influence or contribution of German theologians, like the whole history is taken to be salvation history, and therefore even secular histories have to be looked into it. Now, I think that part of it, the Hindu forces have started looking at it from that angle. And we cannot say at this time that some you can say theoretical or the fundamental or the structural understanding of the Hindu view of life, of history, which will be introduced into our historiography. As you know, that from 50 onwards, the leftist, one can say so, we can say so, Nurul Hassan and Radhakishan's son also, and Guha and others who are most of our historians have taken the Marxist Hegelian thought, and unfortunately they have come from the communist area of Bengal, as you know. So they are much influenced by the so-called subalterns as the labor movement and the farmers' movements. So we will be able to see the way in which history will take place in future. You are right in pointing out that we have. I'm the son of my father, so I followed him because he was a Sanskrit grammarian, and he always goes to the grammar, etymological understanding. Therefore, the history, as as the Western understanding goes, we have to understand from the history. Whereas you have pointed out the different aspect of history, which we have it as a source material, and we always say Puran Ityas. Ityas etymologically refers to tradition, and now they will be bringing in all tradition. Katha is also there, Puran is also there, myths are also there. How are they going to interpret it? I will be interested. There is no clear view has come for our understanding. And therefore, I think I will be looking forward the way in which the history or the study of history will be taking place in India, as you are also interested. On how our theologian, historians will look at it, at the church history as such, from the different point of view. That will be, I think, from this seminar and with the two senior most people among us who have worked in India, who have brought out those sources to the fore. And you will see that most of our Indian scholars, they don't go to the sources because they are in different languages, they are in different historical context, and there are so much differences in their passing on traditions. So a little bit, I think, very, very serious study has to be done, as you people have given almost whole life. We are lacking those kind of scholars. I hope with interacting with you, many more will come. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ravi. We are so happy that you could make it. We would also like to hear, if possible, Mr. John Frykenberg, your take about history and what have you. You've been a teacher of history and you have observed history. So if you can say a few words.
I'm happy to say a few words. I've been teaching at a community college level, I still do, in California, at Lancaster, which is in the high desert above Los Angeles, and also at West Los Angeles College. And I currently teach US history, both current and from origins. And I also teach African American history from origins to current, which is a hot topic in the United States today, to say the least. And some of my background there is I'm not a trained historian, but I've been doing it for about 10 years. I do have a degree from the University of Rhode Island in actually African and Asian history. So how I got into US history is a different story entirely. But I have had the opportunity to have extensive contact in Nigeria over the past decade. I've been going to Nigeria to teach skills in how to make a job, entrepreneurial studies in Nigeria at about 10 separate universities. So we've taught with a team. We've developed a curriculum and have taught our course to about 12,000 university students so far that have been certificated just to enable them to find and make a job on their own. In terms of the history, what I say to my students is what you say to your students, is that we can learn from history. There are valuable lessons to be learned, but that the tendency is that we do not learn from history. And so that's why history has a tendency to repeat itself. which is very unfortunate. And dealing with postmodernism is extremely difficult concept to deal with as a Christian, because people, they pick their own fruit and they decide what's true for them, and whatever seems to work for them. And in order to the whole business that we have in terms of critical race theory and that we're struggling with now, I think that people have come to realize in the United States that our educational system, both at the university level and the secondary school level and even primary, has been very destructive to our society. And people are talking a lot about Rome these days, and how the Roman Empire came apart. And are we, as Pogo, the cartoon person says, he says, we have found the enemy and they is us. And so that is a difficult thing for us to grasp and to deal with and to be able to reason with people. We feel like the nation is coming apart at the seams. So it's a very difficult time for us, and you have to be honestly very careful about what you say. In our amendments, free speech is something that we embrace and that we cherish. And we found that that all of a sudden free speech is under attack. Given my Christian views at the colleges that I teach at, if you were to read the emails and you were to read the various seminars that they have now, you become very skeptical about participating in some of them, because you could lose your job in about 5 minutes flat. And that perhaps is a challenge for Christians, is how best to communicate with people in academia. I feel very privileged that at least I have my students, and what influence I can have while giving them historical fact is that we can talk about our Christian faith, and I can as Socrates did, we can question. And we can say, well, did you think about this? Or did you think about that? And perhaps that will give them a little better perspective. And because students in particular, given critical race theory and what they're hearing now, is they would like to choose their beliefs and they don't always consider the facts at all. The advantage of a historian, or when the revolutions come, who are the first to go? They're the philosophers and the historians. They have their heads on the block, so to speak. And so we choose our words carefully, and hopefully we sprinkle some salt in there. So as the scripture says, salt, to be salt and light. And I think that's where I'm coming from, and probably all I really have to say, but I appreciate your asking.
Thank you. Thank you. That's lovely. We can take maybe one or two questions. Going back, Professor Bob, can you hear me? There is one question about, going to south of India, to the very tip, to Kerala. One of our friends here, Rahul, wants to ask, there is a controversy when Brahmins or Brahmanism reached Kerala. There is this whole Kerala Thomas Christians issue. So what has your research, or what does it say about when did Brahmanism or Brahmins reach Kerala?
I'll make several confessions here. Amongst the 4 major civilizations of South India, if I could use the term, for the oldest and most ancient, of course, is the Tamil. And the cousins to this are, to the east, to the west, you get the Malayali culture, and slightly to the north, you get the Kannada, and then the Telugu, those 4. And the Tamil are the classic, claim to almost predate Sanskrit, but that's very arguable, but there are people who do this sort of thing. But the interesting thing is, I think that the people who ruled in Tamil kingdoms, the Vallalars, coming from the north. And they did this long before, and the Sangam poem. And it's good for us to remember that Bhakti religion has its origins in the Tamil poets of the South. Bhakti comes from the South itself. That they were there before, as I understand it, before the Brahmins came into Kerala. And the person I look to as the authority here is Professor Pius Malankantadil. I don't know how to pronounce that properly. Maybe one of you Keralites can pronounce that for me better. Do you know the name?
Yes.
And he's a professor in the School of History. There are two professors in the School of History in JNU. He and another person by the name of Joy Pachau, who comes from the Northeast India.
He's around.
But anyway, he has written essays on this, any number of essays, and from what I gather from my reading, the Christians, the earliest Christians, especially take the canonical belief of the arrival of Christians, or even if you take the arrival of Christians of Thomas Kanai in 345 AD, which is fairly well established, were there before. They came during the time when there were, but there's a dispute as to whether Brahmins were there or not. And it's quite possible that Brahmins were coming into Kerala at about the same time or slightly afterwards. So that in fact, you have these two communities. Not only that, probably a third community. There were Jewish people in South India at that time, very ancient Jewish people. And of course, the people who were in Thomas Kanai, the 200 families, called them, they were Hebrew Christians. They were not just Christians, but they were Hebrew Christians who came from Maruhu in Iraq. What we now have is Iraq in Mesopotamia. So those people came with their literature, came with their liturgy, their Syriac scriptures, and so forth and so on. So that elite culture, the elite cultures of South India have consisted of Brahmins, Nayars, and these Thomas Christians from a very ancient time. And it's important to note that the Kanai Christians, Malankara Nazranis, as they were called themselves Southists because they settled on the south bank of the Periyar River, but they were considered to be the younger group, and there was an older group that they tended to sometimes look down upon, but there was an older group called the Northists. I will not try to repeat the Malayali name of those South and Northists, but there they were. And they go back, and I would say that probably there's a good chance that the Brahmins came in at about the same time and that they were not necessarily earlier. But there was already a much earlier strong Brahmin community in Tamil Nadu by the time they come there. That's my personal conclusion.
Professor, since I asked the question, from what I have been reading, it seems to indicate that the earliest Hindu temples are from the 7th century AD. So is that correct? Is that true? Were there temples before in the BC era also in Kerala? If not, what was the religion of Kerala before the Jews, the Christians, and the Brahmins came?
Well, let's go away from the word Hindu. I think that's not the concept I would use. I would say there were religions, there were local religions. I would point you to a book, and I'll hold it up for you to look at, a recent book that has investigated these sorts of things, and that is this book right here. You see this? It's edited by my friend Jeff Oddie, and I would recommend that you look at that book because it deals with the whole question of when do you define Hindu? There were local religions, and yes, there were local temples, but there were local village temples from primordial times. So when did the large temples begin to come into being? And you know, I have had one of my PhD students did a study of the Meenakshi Sundareshwara temple of Madurai. She sat in that temple for 2 years. Simply sat in that temple, can you imagine it, for 2 years,
Wow.
absorbing from people the lore of that temple. And it's soon discovered that, like most temples in India, it starts with some little puja done under a tree with some coconuts and so forth and so on, a ring of stones and so forth. You know, a small shrine grows, a little larger shrine grows, then there's a person who's a guardian of the shrine who puts out a begging bowl. You don't dare to go to the market without giving some money lest you have bad luck, and so on and
Right.
so on. And before you know it, this becomes a larger place and a larger place until you get a place which now has a daytime population of 100,000. You see?
Right.
So when did those
Kerala-
temples come into being? I'm not a specialist on when those temples came into being.
Sure, sure.
But
So Kerala
I have.
Buddhist
Have you
mind-
been to Padma? Have you been to the Padmanabhapuram?
Yeah, yes, in Trivandrum, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, when did that place come into being? I don't know.
They say it's a Buddhist site which the Hindus appropriated. Is that correct?
Well, who can say? But I mean, the term is, we use the term Hindu when we say Hindu appropriation. When does the term appropriation become even valid? You know, there become cults that dealt with things at the higher level, and the appropriation and the amalgamation. And I think it's important to remember here that of all the peoples in India, the great classifiers and the developer of concepts who can challenge the Greeks in develop, you know, most of our English vocabulary is based upon Greek analytical vocabulary. The very word concept, the word analysis, synthesis, these are all Greek terms. Likewise, in India, the people who developed the vocabulary of analysis were the Brahmins. So they
Right.
gave the categories their names. From them we get the term Varna, from them you get the term Varna, Brahman, Dharma, so forth and so on. So at what point do they begin to absorb local village deities into the larger kathas that they have developed? That's a very interesting question. Every village in South India has a goddess, and that goddess was sometimes seen to be quite malevolent and had to be appeased. In early days, there were blood sacrifices for this. And in fact, at one time, there were even human sacrifices in some places. And certainly coconuts and one thing or another, sacrifices, were given to appease the wrath of the local goddess, the Shakti.
Right.
But then the Brahmins developed the concept of Mahashakti and so forth. You know, I'm telling you all things you already know. And I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But I think that if you look at it in that fashion, I think you can see how a pattern of grows whereby the great classifiers give names to things, but I don't think they gave the name Hinduism to India.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Professor Bob. I think there is no more question. If there is any, if I'm leaving anyone,
Dr. Samuel.
I had asked this question. It was written there. Why is there this special attraction for history as rhetoric, especially with the right-wingers around the world?
Well, you know, I have used that as a stalking horse for a chapter that I wrote for these various schools in which what Dr. Webster has just talked about with respect to the rise of relativism, if you take the relativist route far enough, history simply becomes an exercise in rhetoric. But I have others, you know, at what point is history a science? At what point is history something else? If you look at all the chapters in the book that I wrote, you'll see that there are 10 chapters, and that one on rhetoric is only one of the 10 chapters. And therefore, there are many ways to approach our understandings of history as we develop it. And I don't think that rhetoric is simply the language used. This is the Greek analytical term for persuasion, for persuading people to believe what you are saying and that your understanding is correct. Whether in fact the rhetoric is effective or not effective is another matter. You see, so therefore I say as a subtitle to that chapter, a disputed discourse. The term discourse in with these postmodern people. Up until then, you didn't even find them being used. They turned the term, you have your discourse, I have mine, you know, this sort of thing.